Just now, America's Funniest Woman gave her best performance to yet. The audience in the studio sat in startled silence. The team was trying not to cry. It would be referred to as television gold by critics. There would be awards. However, Carol Burnett vowed to herself as she left the stage. That was an episode she would never watch. Not once. Never. She has fulfilled that pledge for 47 years. The lady who made a living by making others laugh couldn't bear to look in the mirror when she revealed the whole truth. There were no jokes or amusing voices, just heartbreaking honesty that went so deep that it destroyed everything her program stood for. What took place in the few minutes in 1977 that America's love interest would live with for the rest of her life? And why would someone who has been making fun of suffering for decades now make something that is too real to deal with? A childhood that would have broken most people before they could even dream has the key to the solution. In San Antonio, a 2-year-old girl waits by a window for footsteps that could bring love rather than mayhem. However, the footsteps are those of strangers in their own house. Parents who are so inebriated that they fail to remember that their daughter is in need of them. There is no laughter at the start of Carol Burnett's story. Silence is the first thing that occurs. The kind of deafening silence that permeates a home where grown-ups have opted for bottles rather than bedtime tales, where a child discovers that sometimes the safest way to live is to remain invisible. Her father's hands were too trembling to retain a permanent job, so he worked intermittently at a movie theater. Even while she was physically there, her mother was emotionally gone, living in a fog of unfulfilled promises and sour aspirations. Both would ultimately pass away from their addictions, leaving Carol with a legacy of desertion that would follow her for years. This is the amazing thing about the human spirit, though. It manages to survive under the most dire conditions. Carol had already found something potent by the time she was a toddler. That even for a brief instant, making someone laugh may make suffering more tolerable. Her parents found redemption in an unexpected location once they finally abandoned all parenting pretenses. She was taken to Hollywood by her grandmother, Mabel White, who rescued her from the turmoil of Texas. However, they were not greeted with a red carpet. Instead, they ended up in a dilapidated boarding home with just one little room. Surrounded by the neglected spirits of humanity. Their weekly income was $20. Since they were unable to purchase toilet paper, they steal it covertly from movie theater restrooms. It was out of sheer desperation, not greed. But a mystical event took place inside those deteriorating walls. Carol found what would be both her greatest strength and her biggest weakness. The capacity to bring happiness even in the face of pain. She created Karen, a twin sister. Carol wasn't anything compared to Karen. Self-assured, attractive, and always joyful. Even the desperate grown-ups around them thought Karen actually existed because Carol made her so real. She'd dash up the fire escape, change her hair and clothes, and then she'd be back as Karen. Charming and lighthearted. This wasn't a simple game. Carol's first master lesson in performance and the realization that sometimes you have to be someone else was this one. So they can temporarily forget their own suffering. However, Carol's favorite escape occurred every Saturday when she and her grandma would spend 50 cents, more than 10% of their weekly income, on cinema tickets. Carol could forget about screaming voices and flaking paint for those few hours in the dark. Life glittered on film. People were kissing, stars were dancing, and Carol heard something in one of those dim theaters that would permanently alter her life. Carol was struck like lightning by Johnny Weissmuller's iconic Tarzan shout as it reverberated across the room. After returning home, she started to meticulously replicate that sound, honing every note and cadence. She didn't realize she was honing her voice and developing the breath control that most singers need years to learn. It was only a game to her. However, audiences would eventually erupt in laughter and applause at that cry. One of her first comedic techniques was what started out as a child's frantic mimicry. Carol Burnett had learnt the most significant lesson of her life by the time she was 7 years old. A world out to shatter her spirit was protected by laughter. However, she was unaware that the same shield would eventually become too hefty for her to hold. Young Carol had no idea the ways that shield would be put to the test. Carol had one desire as high school graduation drew near: one that seemed both unachievable and inevitable. Reporting. Carol felt compelled to complete her mother's unfinished work because her mother had always aspired to be a writer. The objective was UCLA, but she was confronted with a harsh reality when it came time to enroll. She lacked the $50 required for tuition. It would have been the end of the dream for most people. And it appeared to be for a time. Then an extraordinary event occurred. Carol never found out who it was, but a stranger came forward and gave her the precise amount she required. There are no conditions or explanations. Just enough cash to permanently alter her life. Carol had intended to study journalism at UCLA, but destiny had other ideas. Her entire world was turned upside down by one elective theater class. Something clicked inside her in that classroom. She had lost her shyness. Wasn't invisible or impoverished. She was lively, humorous, and full of life. The gamble of changing majors soon paid off. She received the UCLA Theater program's Most Promising Newcomer Award at the conclusion of her freshman year. It was confirmation that she wasn't insane for pursuing this unattainable ideal, and it went beyond simply being a title. However, Carol's greatest breakthrough came in the most surprising way. She found herself at a party in San Diego, working as an usherette for 65 cents an hour, cramming hors d'oeuvres into her purse to take home to her grandma. At that moment, a stranger with a sharp outfit came up to her. He wasn't a performer. He came from La Jolla and was a millionaire shipbuilder. He offered Carol an offer that seemed too good to be true after she informed him that she had an ambition of traveling to New York to make it on Broadway. She and her lover, Don Soroyan, each received $1,000. But with 3 conditions: only use the funds to travel to New York, never divulge his identity, and if they succeeded, they had to assist others in doing the same. He wanted no acknowledgement or credit. He merely stated that he was repaying someone who had once assisted him. Carol and Don packed up and departed UCLA with $2,000 in hand. Carol had never traveled farther than Texas, but they proceeded east. She didn't care that she didn't know anyone in New York. She didn't know enough to be afraid, as she later stated. The money began vanishing at a startlingly rapid pace. Carol once started crying as she was calling her family, who pleaded with her to return home. She was on the verge of giving up when she heard a radio announcement that would make all the difference. Carol, a hurricane, was heading up the coast. She interpreted it as a sign, which in some way gave her the willpower to stick around and defend her aspirations. Soon after, she ended up at the Rehearsal Club, a former boarding home for young ladies attempting to make their mark in the arts. Received a cot in a room with 4 other actresses for $18 per week. She saw it as paradise, even though there was only 1 wardrobe and 1 bathroom. A love ballad about the stern, overly serious U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles gave her her first major break. It was a ridiculous and outrageous joke tune, but Carol sang it so well that it became one of her signature songs. The crowds went crazy. She was invited to both the Ed Sullivan and Jack Parr shows. Her knees trembled as she took the stage at Sullivan, but by the end of her performance, everyone was giggling with delight, and precisely 5 years after that enigmatic loan, Carol and Don returned the entire $2,000. The wealthy remained nameless until the very end and never replied. Carol's triumph, however, was only getting started. She would soon become one of the biggest stars in television history thanks to the foundation she was laying, which transformed vulnerability into strength and sorrow into performance. She had no idea that this same gift would eventually make her face an unbearable reality. In show business, success has a tendency of accelerating faster than anyone could have imagined, and for Carol, that acceleration peaked with the debut of The Carol Burnett Show. That night, television history was made. Every week for 11 consecutive seasons, 30 million people flocked to their TV sets to watch Carol and her ensemble perform magic. This was a cultural phenomenon, not just a result of high viewership. But this is what really made it revolutionary. The first female host of a primetime variety program was Carol Burnett. She not only cracked the glass ceiling in a male-dominated field, but she broke it entirely. The popularity of the show wasn't a coincidence. Carol had put together a dream squad that seemed to click in almost unnatural ways. Harvey Korman contributed flawless timing and training in theater. Vicki Lawrence began her career as a teenager and rose to fame in comedy. There was Tim Conway after that. Conway was a suit-clad chaos control expert. He had a rule that could not be broken. Don't overdo it during rehearsals. He thoroughly distracted everyone else by saving his greatest parts for the live tapings. Every performance was therefore brand new and incredibly exciting. The most well-known instance occurred during what is now referred to as the elephant narrative. Conway began a lengthy, absurd story about a circus elephant in a sketch from their recurrent family series. Carol, Vicki, and Harvey made a valiant effort to remain in character while he babbled on, but the story continued to get more bizarre and funny. Even Vicki Lawrence went utterly crazy at the end. Everyone on set, even Conway himself, laughed when she responded with a phrase so unexpected. Such moments turned into the show's essence. The accolades came pouring in, unscripted, authentic, and raw. It won 25 Emmys throughout its existence. Carol won several Golden Globes herself. The show had an impact on everything that followed in addition to providing entertainment. The foundation Carol's show established for sketch comedy is a huge debt to Saturday Night Live. However, the most intricate recurrent portion of the show was also its most remembered. Drawings of the family. Carol portrayed Eunice Higgins, a character burdened by unfulfilled hopes and disappointments. These sketches typically combined dysfunction and humor, with a hint of sarcasm to keep things fresh. Eunice felt that life had passed her by and was irritated and resentful. Although the character was humorous, there was always a darker side to them that Carol was all too familiar with: a melancholy. These sketches successfully balanced comedy and drama for years. While audiences chuckled, they also saw that Eunice's troubles were genuine. Because she stood for everyone who has ever felt stuck or questioned whether their aspirations are merely silly delusions, the character struck a chord. However, Carol and the writers made the decision to push the threshold even farther when the program entered its 10th year. Together, they created a piece that would push the boundaries of comedy, television, and Carol's threshold for tolerance. They were unaware that they were going to produce something so potent and destructive that Carol would be plagued by it for the rest of her life. Only a few weeks remained until the performance that would force her to swear to herself that she would never see it again. What happens when a person who has dedicated their professional life to turning suffering into laughing eventually runs upon suffering that is too intense to change? Carol Burnett was going to learn in the most conspicuous manner imaginable. It was a family sketch that the authors had never created before. It was titled The Gong Show, and it would force Carol and Eunice Higgins into uncharted terrain. Eunice, who believes that singing on television will finally bring her the fame and acclaim she has long desired, enters a low-rent talent competition in the sketch. The writers made a decision that would alter the entire plot, even though there were a dozen possible comic outcomes for this scenario. Just a woman, desperate and naive, thinking that this one moment may ultimately legitimize her entire existence. No jokes, no strange accent, no exaggerated movements. Finding the light in the dark and turning suffering into laughter had been the cornerstones of Carol's profession. However, there would be no change this time. The agony would just be pain this time. Something changed when Carol appeared as Eunice on that phony talent show stage while the cameras were rolling. Expecting to chuckle, the studio audience was treated to a completely other show. This was no joke. Millions of people watched live as this procedure was done without anesthesia. Eunice put her everything into a performance that she genuinely thought would transform her life, singing with a voice full of frantic hope. The judges' reaction followed, with Alan Ludden, a real-life game show host, leading the way. They destroyed her rather than merely criticizing her. They made fun of her dreams, voice, and attractiveness. They made fun of her in the same way that everyone else had made fun of Eunice. All of Carol's facial expressions were captured by the camera. The realization that she had been deluding herself, the hope withering in her eyes, and the crushing weight of a lifetime of failure ultimately broke her spirit. The lights then dimmed in a moment that took the studio by surprise. As Eunice sat by herself on the stage, tears running down her cheeks, the camera gradually drew away. Just a broken woman and the sound, no music, no joke, no rescue. Of her own tears. The audience in the studio was unsure of how to respond. They had come for the chuckles, but what they saw was more akin to a documentary than a comedy sketch. The crew was astonished and silent. Carol was the most affected, but many others were holding back their own tears. She left the stage as soon as the cameras stopped rolling, having made a self-promise that she has adhered to for 47 years. That was a performance she will never see. Never, ever, ever. She would explain why years later. She said the agony was too genuine. In many respects, Eunice's destruction was her own, therefore it seemed like her own. Carol had experienced poverty as a child, had had unrealistic goals, and had been mocked and ignored. She understood what it was like to have such a strong desire for something that you would sacrifice everything for the chance. She was aware of how debilitating it is to be told that you are not talented, attractive, or good enough. Eunice was depicted in that sketch as more than just broken. In a heartbreaking 7-minute performance that would be praised as a masterpiece of television, it captured every moment Carol had ever been broken. The appreciation from the critics was unanimous. There were awards. Carol failed to understand that the performance was new, trailblazing, and a flawless fusion of comedy and drama, proving that television could be art. She could only see her own suffering, mirrored back to her in high definition, and projected to millions of viewers who were unaware that they were witnessing someone else's real anguish. That episode has been there for 47 years, but Carol won't go there. She has never been able to confront it, even though it is there, waiting for her. After transforming suffering into amusement for her whole career, the woman eventually produced something too genuine, unvarnished, and honest to witness. Perhaps that is the strongest evidence of her artistic ability. The best performances can occasionally be the ones that break us in the process of becoming. Those who knew Carol's story were aware of the irony. This was a woman who had persevered through poverty, abandonment, and heartbreaking disappointment. She had made every setback into a victory and every heartache into a joke. However, she was unable to confront 7 minutes of her own reality being filmed. However, life continued to challenge her, even avoiding that one performance. Carrie, her daughter, would fight addiction from the age of 13. Carol's child will battle demons that were strikingly similar to the ones that destroyed her own parents. Carol defended Carrie with the same tenacity that she had shown to her work. She used the idea that you sometimes have to love someone so much that you allow them to despise you. After Carrie finally cleaned up, she and Carol were closer than before. Together, they created Hollywood Arms, a Broadway production inspired by Carol's early years. However, tragedy struck once more when Carrie passed away from pneumonia brought on by lung cancer at the age of 38. Despite her heartbreak, Carol completed the play. It was her duty to Carrie. She claimed that after Carol's youngest daughter, Erin, developed an addiction of her own, the cycle persisted. Carol took charge of her grandson Dylan at the age of 87. 3 generations had been anchored by the woman who had begun life as an unwanted child. Carol Burnett is still performing to make people laugh at the age of 91. She has made appearances on Palm Royale and Better Call Saul in recent years, demonstrating that skill does not fade with age. However, that episode is still untouchable even after 7 decades of performing. Like a fragment of her soul that she lost and can never fully recover, it rests in the archives. The one-time broadcast altered television forever. It demonstrated that viewers were hungry for something genuine and that comedies could have dramatic weight. It made it feasible for shows to combine sadness with humor in ways that didn't seem possible until Carol proved it was possible. However, the personal toll was high. Carol has characterized the sketch as both vital and devastating in interviews over the years. She thinks she's happy they did it because it was meaningful and honest. However, she discovered that sometimes the cost of the truth is too great to bear twice. That performance continues to be the one reality Carol is unable to accept. She has won every award imaginable, dominated stages all around the world, and used her gift to change the lives of millions. However, she is unable to access the location of that 7-minute sketch. That might be okay. Perhaps some works of art are intended to be too strong for their creator to handle. Carol's inability to watch it may be evidence of its authenticity. Even now, humor and drama are still influenced by the episode that was broadcast 47 years ago. Carol Burnett, however, still sees it as a room in her mind that she's never quite prepared to access, a door that she locked and closed. That might be the last lesson in Carol's inspiring tale. Giving away aspects of oneself that you can never fully recover can occasionally result in the best works of art. Making people laugh can occasionally require facing realities that are too difficult to bear twice. And sometimes the performance that you can't bear to watch again is the most impactful.